The morning after her arrival, the land greeted her with a silence unlike any she had known before. No shouting voices, no laughter at her expense, no doors slammed to keep her out. Only the calls of birds, the creak of wooden fences, and the soft breath of cattle. She stood at the doorway of the ranch house, the rising sun warming her face as she watched the rancher move across the yard with deliberate ease, feeding the animals, checking the horses, his movements efficient and sure. There was something calming about the rhythm of his work, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to rush, no panic clawing at her chest. Still, doubt weighed heavily on her. She had spoken wild words in the heat of desperation, and though he had not turned her away, she wondered if he regretted it now. Would he one day look at her as the others had, with disdain or pity? She hugged herself tightly as she stepped into the dirt yard, her shoes sinking into the earth. He noticed her approach, but said nothing, only glanced at her with a small nod that carried no judgment, only quiet acknowledgement. That nod, simple as it was, meant more than 100 promises. He handed her a bucket of feed without a word, and though her hands trembled, she took it. The chickens clucked nervously as she scattered the grain, her awkward movements drawing a faint, nearly hidden smile from him. She had never done such work before, and yet he didn't correct her harshly, didn't scold when she spilled half the bucket. He only watched, patient, letting her learn at her own pace. She felt foolish, but also useful, needed. The farm didn't laugh at her. The animals didn't mock her. For once, her presence mattered in a way she could feel. At midday, they ate together on the porch, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. She could sense his caution, the way he measured his words, and she respected it. He was not a man to waste breath or offer false kindness. He spoke only when he meant it, and though he had not said much since that night, his actions had been louder than any speech. He had given her shelter, he had given her work. And in the way he handed her bread and poured her water, she felt a tenderness that no one else had ever offered. The days stretched into weeks, each one smoothing away a layer of her fear. She learned to move with the rhythm of the ranch, rising at dawn, feeding animals, gathering eggs, hanging laundry on the line that swayed in the prairie breeze. At night, she sat by the fire while he read old ledgers or mended tools. They spoke little, but when they did, it was honest. He asked about her past only once, and when she refused to answer, he never pressed again. It was as though he knew her silence was already full of pain. Instead, he let her write her story anew through the life she lived beside him. Yet deep within her, the vow she had made in front of the crowd haunted her. "I will have your baby." Those words had not been planned, and yet they had bound her fate to his. Sometimes she lay awake at night, staring at the wooden beams above her bed, wondering if he thought of them, if he expected her to prove them true. She wasn't sure herself what had driven her to speak them. Was it survival? Was it a longing for love? Or had something in his steady eyes awakened a need she had buried too long? One evening, as the wind howled outside and the lantern flickered low, she found herself staring at him across the table. His hands were rough, scarred by work, yet gentle in the way they held a cup. His shoulders bore the weight of land, labor, and loneliness, and yet he carried it all without complaint. She realized then that she wanted, not just needed, but truly wanted to be by his side. Not because she had spoken wild words in front of a crowd, not because she was desperate for shelter, but because in him she saw the rarest thing she had ever known: safety. Her chest tightened with an ache she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Do you ever regret bringing me here?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. He looked at her, long and steady, his expression unreadable for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then he shook his head slowly, firmly. "No, not once." The words hit her harder than she expected, breaking down the last wall she had held inside. Tears stung her eyes, and she turned away, afraid to let him see, but he already had. He didn't move to comfort her, not in the way others might have. He didn't offer empty words or promises. Instead, he placed his hand gently over hers on the table, grounding her like the earth beneath their boots. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but to her it was everything. In that touch, she felt her vow transform from a desperate claim to a quiet truth. Maybe, just maybe, the future she had spoken aloud could grow here, on this land, between these two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of ways. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters, she repeated her words in her mind, not with fear, but with certainty. I will have your baby. They were no longer a cry of desperation. They were a promise, a seed planted deep in her heart, waiting for the day it would bloom under the wide, endless skies of the Wild West. The saloon doors creaked as she stumbled out into the dusty street, her voice trembling yet fierce, words spilling from her lips like a vow carved out of desperation and defiance. I will have your baby, she said, her eyes fixed on the tall rancher standing near his horse. The crowd, half drunk on whiskey and gossip, froze in silence. Men chuckled behind their mugs, women whispered behind fans, but her voice carried louder than their scorn. She wasn't begging, she was declaring, and that difference struck him deeper than he expected. The rancher turned slowly, the brim of his hat shading his eyes, though nothing could hide the weight of his gaze. He had lived a life of dust and labor, accustomed to the rough edges of a world that rarely gave second chances. And yet in her, he saw something raw and unbroken, despite the tremble in her hands and the dirt on her dress. She was not just asking for shelter or protection or kindness. She was demanding a future, tying herself to him with words that would mark them both in the memory of everyone present. The onlookers muttered, some laughing at the audacity, others shaking their heads in disbelief. No woman spoke like that, not in public, not with such fire. But she had nothing left to lose, and perhaps that was what gave her courage. She had been cast aside, betrayed, pushed into corners until only one path remained, to claim what she wanted, boldly, recklessly, with no thought for tomorrow. And she had chosen him, the man with calloused hands and a steady presence, the one who didn't flinch when the world grew cruel. For a long moment, he said nothing. The street held its breath. She expected rejection, a hard laugh, maybe even a cruel dismissal like all the others before. But instead he walked forward, his boots pressing into the dirt with calm, unhurried certainty. When he stopped in front of her, he didn't look at the crowd, didn't bow to their judgment. He looked only at her, into her defiant eyes, and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. Then you're coming with me. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but he didn't wait for their response. With one strong motion, he lifted her into the saddle, her hands gripping his shoulders in shock. The murmurs followed them as he swung up behind her, taking the reins with ease. The horse snorted, impatient to leave, and within moments they were riding out of town, the jeers fading behind them until only the wind and the sound of hooves remained. She pressed against him, not from fear, but from a sudden overwhelming relief that he hadn't turned her away. The plain stretched endlessly before them, the sky painted with streaks of gold and crimson. She breathed in the scent of leather and dust, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart against her back. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of survival ease, if only slightly. His arms, firm around her, did not feel like chains, but like walls shielding her from a world that had chewed her up and spat her out. The future was still uncertain, but the present was undeniable. She belonged here, in this moment with him. When they arrived at his ranch, the land opened like a promise, rolling fields, a weathered barn, and a modest house that stood proud against the horizon. He dismounted first, then helped her down, his grip steady, his expression unreadable. She looked around, stunned by the silence of the place, the absence of judgmental eyes and cruel laughter. Here there was only the lowing of cattle, the soft rustle of grass, the smell of earth and wood. For the first time, she felt like she had stepped into a place where her words might not be mocked, where her vow might be honored. That evening they sat by a fire outside the house, the prairie stretching endlessly into the dark. He said little, but the silence was not cold. She could feel the weight of his thoughts, the careful way he measured every action. He had not taken her in haste, nor had he accepted her words without understanding their meaning. He was a man who carried responsibility like he carried his hat, not as a burden, but as a part of himself. She realized then that he had not taken her away just to silence the crowd. He had taken her because something in her words had struck the truth within him, as the course of a life forever. The morning light crept over the riverbank, painting the world in soft gold. I woke to find her already standing by the water, her figure tall and still against the current that had nearly claimed me. She seemed carved out of the land itself, strong and unbending, yet I caught the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly when she thought I wasn't watching. She had carried her grief for so long that it seemed to weigh heavier than any stone. And yet when she turned and saw me awake, her face hardened again, not cruelly, but with the kind of resolve only loss can forge. She handed me food, simple, foraged berries and a strip of dried venison, and waited until I ate, her eyes fixed on me as if ensuring I still drew breath. "You live because of me," she said bluntly, and though the words might have sounded like arrogance, her voice trembled faintly with something else, perhaps fear that I might deny it, perhaps fear I might leave. I nodded slowly, chewing the tough meat, realizing that she needed my acknowledgement as much as I needed her strength. We traveled together that day, her stride swift and steady as mine faltered behind her. She knew every bend in the river, every tree whose roots could trip a careless step. She walked as though the earth itself was her kin, and I felt clumsy in comparison. More than once she reached back without looking, offering her hand to steady me, and though my pride resisted, I took it. Her grip was warm, grounding, and each time I let her pull me along, I felt a strange thread binding tighter between us. As we walked, I asked her name. She hesitated, then spoke it softly, as if saying it aloud threatened to stir ghosts. Tayin, a name that rolled like thunder but carried the sorrow of rain. She told me no more than that, but I noticed the way her hand brushed the necklace she wore whenever silence stretched too long. The small silver ring caught the light, a token that whispered of a husband gone, a life cut short. She never spoke his name, but she didn't have to. I could feel his absence in the heaviness of her steps. That evening, as we made camp in a grove sheltered from the wind, I tried to thank her properly. Words failed me. How does a man repay his life? With gold? With service? With silence? She watched me fumble, then shook her head as if she already knew. "You think too much," she said, her lips pressing into the faintest of smiles. "You breathe, that is enough." But when she said it, her eyes searched mine with a hunger for something more, something I wasn't yet ready to name. The days blurred into one another. She taught me to move quietly, to listen to the land, to read the sky. I found myself watching her more than I watched the trail, the sure way she crouched to examine tracks, the way the wind teased strands of her hair, the way her laughter, rare and sudden, startled me more than the cry of an eagle overhead. She didn't laugh often, but when she did, it was like the river's roar softened into a song only she could sing. And yet, beneath all her strength, I caught glimpses of the widow's ache she carried. At night, when the fire burned low and she thought I slept, she would take the necklace into her hands, her thumb tracing the small ring as tears shone in her eyes. She never let them fall, not once, but I saw the way she swallowed them, burying sorrow so deep it threatened to consume her. In those moments, I understood why she had claimed me with such fierce words. She wasn't just holding on to me. She was holding on to the idea that fate had given her a new reason to live. One night, unable to bear the silence between us, I asked her gently, "Why me?" The question hung heavy, like smoke in still air. She looked into the fire for a long while before answering. "Because the river tried to take you, and I could not let it win again." Her voice cracked, and though she said no more, I understood. The river had already taken her husband. It had left her empty, widowed, broken. And in saving me, she had defied it, reclaimed what it had stolen. Her honesty struck me like an arrow. She didn't want pity. She wanted defiance, survival, something to anchor her to the living. And though I had no right to her claim, no bond of blood or vow, I found myself wanting to give her what she needed. Not out of debt, not out of guilt, but out of something growing quietly between us, like roots spreading unseen beneath the soil. By the time we lay down beneath the stars, the fire's embers painting her face in soft glow, I no longer felt like her captive or her debt to fate. I felt something different, heavier, sharper, almost frightening in its certainty. The river had nearly stolen my life, but she had given it back, and perhaps more than that. Perhaps she had given me a new one entirely.